Hello and good afternoon, everybody. You are very welcome to our debate. I think you indeed might know our panel quite well. On my right, we have Harry Handelsman, CEO of Manhattan Loft Corporation. We have John Meason, VP Advanced Programs at Schindler, and Paul Monaghan, Director of AHMM. And I think that today, high-rise living in a European context is a very worthwhile discussion and debate. And I'm hoping that from the floor, we will actually get good questions, not the same old questions. Let's think about new ways of thinking about tall buildings, particularly when it's about residential. So, with the completion of the Shard and a number of tall buildings in the city, and cities such as Liverpool, Manchester and Leeds, the debate really has been sparked about the merits and potentially the potential damaging consequences that tall buildings could have. Some see them as vital in ensuring that we densify our towns and cities and avoid urban sprawl. And on this tiny island with a rising population in the midst of a housing shortage, with NIMBYism a barrier to new development, many have argued that tall buildings are the only way to go. So is the only way up. Others have criticised tall buildings for being inappropriate and destroying the character of our cities. We've had a think tank called Policy Exchange arguing that we should knock down tower blocks and replace them with streets. There are already viewing corridors in cities such as London designed to protect our historic views. But recent criticism from people such as Prince Charles and most notably at the weekend UNESCO has led some people to argue for listed views to ensure the protection of heritage assets. So we have to think, do we think of our history, culture and identity when planning for the future? Criticism has also come from the architectural community with architects such as Ken Yang, who argue about the homogeneity of tall buildings rather than the tall buildings themselves that might be the problem. So today's debate is designed to tease out some of the issues and spark a wider conversation about the future of our cities. A few thoughts before I hand over to our esteemed panel. The densification associated with high-rise living can increase vibrancy and offer more scope to live sustainable urban lifestyles. But it takes innovation and design to ensure that we don't pay the price in terms of places and communities that we then create. Tall buildings need to display a mixing of functions, engaging social spaces, perhaps green spaces, and internal circulation that promotes the support of a social exchange. We've been exploring a mix of functions in tall buildings for some time, but haven't yet been able to master tall buildings as real places, comparable to the best places for exchange in a horizontal city. We need to pay careful attention to the way that tall buildings integrate into the existing urban fabric and build upon it as a strength in an area. Tall buildings need to be built in appropriate locations, or do they? Preferably in clusters or in areas where there is sufficient transport infrastructure to support them. And should we ban the car in inner cities? The environmental conditions both at ground level and inside tall structures are going to be key over the next century. We need to find ways to ensure that these structures have a minimum impact on street-level pedestrians, that's with wind tunnels and with the daylighting or overshadowing, whilst reducing the amount of energy they require to operate. And probably most importantly of all, how do we address climate change and reducing carbon dioxide inputs into our atmosphere? We've all got very high and strict targets. Are we targeting these? Okay, I'm just going to show you a couple of slides. This is a very self-explanatory diagram about how our cities are expanding and how our green space is minimizing. Are we building the right social mix, what you might ask? The diversity of people. Will tall buildings only be for the rich investors from overseas and new homes remain empty? Or can we address our immediate problem? If we look to Denmark, for example, as we're talking about a European context here, if you look at Bjarke Ingels' group, big architects as they're known in Denmark, you can see here where they have designed hundreds of homes that you can actually get access to on this figure-of-8 continually rising street. Do we need lifts at all? If we look to China, we see some very good, tall, elegant structures. But is it the race for height? How tall is yours or mine is bigger than yours? Is it the egotist or the egotistical attitude that is often associated with the tall phallic symbol of our tall buildings? And finally, we have got many questions to ask, but I'm not going to go through all these questions now. I might just look to the last question. Do our politicians do enough to encourage sustainable city living with transport and integrated design systems to allow for long-term city making? Right, I'm going to now hand over to Harry Handelsman, who's going to tell you a little bit about his.
Thank you very much, Angela. I think you raised a lot of issues and I think a lot of questions. And what I really recommend is that you should be advising Boris Johnson, because I think what you stand for is how cities should be developed in terms of tall buildings. But what I will try to do is, albeit it's not the only tall building I've ever built, is I'm going to be slightly more site-specific and I'm going to relate to one particular development and what it is that I'm trying to do over there. What you have is one of the developments that often is described rather cynically by people, which is St. Pancras. St. Pancras, people told me, agents told me, or a developer told me, you know what, Harry, St. Pancras really was a labor of love, wasn't it? In sort of a kind of sneaky kind of way. And you know what, I think it's really sad. I think development should be labors of love. I think if you lose the concept of a labor of love, I think it's really a missed opportunity. Because really what we are doing, we're changing cities, we're changing how people live, or we give opportunity to people. And I think if that should be done strictly for commercial reasons, without love, I think we're missing something. Now, the story of the development on the right, which I refer to as Manhattan of Gardens, started at St. Pancras. It was a site that after many years and months of master planning at Stratford, really, everything was very complex. What are we going to put here? Where are we going to put the stadium? What is going to happen, et cetera, et cetera. All of a sudden, there's this site that arrived, and nobody really addressed it in any shape or form. And I was asked in 2009 by David Joy, who was from LCR, told me, look, I've got this site, and I'd like to develop a hotel there in time for the Olympics. Would you be interested in doing it? The fact that you're doing one at St. Pancras, and would you be interested? My immediate reaction was no. I would not be interested because as far as I was concerned, it might be another folly in terms of the Olympics, 6 weeks of euphoria, and then a lot of devastation. Olympic Village really haven't fared particularly well. But I decided out of politeness, I'm going to go and have a look and see what I can find over there. So I went to Stratford. My offices at the time were Queen Anne Street, very nearby Oxford Circus. And what I decided to do is I was fortunately, I just had hired somebody who was the development director for the commercial aspect of Westfield in Stratford. So I told him, Chris, I've been sort of burdened with the task of volunteering to go to Stratford. How the hell are we going to get there? I told him, well, Harry, if you don't mind taking a walk to Oxford Circus, which is about 2 minutes. I said, no, I don't mind doing that. And then finally, we take the tube. So, okay, there we were chatting on the tube, how are you enjoying your new job? Are things okay? Da-da-da. And, and then it's okay, we have arrived. No, when we've arrived? I said, no, we haven't arrived. I said, no, we have arrived. And I looked at my watch, and it was barely 24 minutes, and I thought going to Stratford really was going to go to Heathrow, which on a daily kind of track isn't something that I particularly enjoy, even though I must confess, see people in my office travel far further than me. But I'm kind of selfish in my development, I think in terms of myself as opposed to necessarily the others. So I arrived in Stratford, and what I really saw, I saw an infrastructure that was almost second to none. I also saw Westfield, obviously under construction, and I'm not a great shopping center fan, but that's irrelevant. But I recognize the importance of them, and I did know what Westfield did at Shepherd's Bush, to me, was an absolute surprise. I would have never imagined that anybody can do it. And sometimes people refer to me as a visionary. Well, there I'm not, because. So I knew that what Westfield was going to do was going to be really amazing. I started looking further afield, and I really saw sort of the infrastructure. And what is going to be a fact is in 4 years' time, we're going to have great arenas in Rio. And 4 years earlier, with fantastic arenas in Beijing. So I know we're going to have an amazing infrastructure. And the more I learned about it, I also saw, but it wasn't just an infrastructure in terms of arenas. It was also a new park, the largest park built over the last 150 years. I mean, when you sort of started looking up a little bit further afield, what you saw is the obvious. The obvious is entrepreneurs, which in my case were developers, buying a piece of property and building sort of high-risey kind of towers, about 20, 23 stories. And really using the concept of pile them high, sell them cheap, Stratford is coming, the Olympics are coming, you're well connected, you have the arenas and everything else. And one of the things that I'm kind of interested in is managing my limited assets. And since I'm a bit of a taxpayer, I figured maybe, spending 12 billion pounds, I'm sure most of it was my money, my taxes, we should have slightly greater ambition than that. And I really thought when I went to see the site, which was absolutely the prime, to me it's the apex site, the best site in the thing is that one should be slightly more ambitious. And one should really try to do something which isn't simply a hotel, but perhaps beyond a hotel. So working with one firm of architects, trying to interpret my vision, which I wasn't satisfied with, I decided, let me go to someone who suggests that, they're aspirational, they're worldwide, and they can do things. And because, I think an architect needs a challenge, I decided, I'm sure some of you are architects over here, and the simpler the brief, the better they get it. So I told him really very simply is, look, what I'd like you to design for me is the best tower. No, I said not the best tower, actually, the best mixed-use tower, hotel at the bottom, residential above in the world. I said, okay, that's too aspirational. I'll give it to you. Let's make it just for Europe and the United States. Because what is happening to the Far East, it's just such a fast-moving kind of thing. So I want him to do that. And really, and the great thing about it is you don't have to do it by tomorrow. I'm actually going to give you 72 hours. And sure enough, they came with not one option. They came actually up with 3 options, of which one was a real obvious one. And really, the challenge, I was slightly more specific to be there, because what has happened in London over the last 10 years. 10 years ago, I developed something which is called West India Quay, which is across from Canary Wharf, a 33-story residential tower. At the time, it was the tallest residential tower. And I really wanted to introduce the best of North American living into the UK. And I think we achieved it with that. I think since that, partially because of planning, Kent Livingstone, followed by Boris Johnson, the encouragement of London being a world city, and in introducing taller and taller buildings, more and more of those buildings are being built. And they're being built really on the concept of, let's build high, because that's planning gain. Then let us go sell it in the Far East, because that gives us a certain certainty of the viability of the project. Then let's sell a bit more over here, etc. And I really felt that fundamentally there might be something slightly different to that. And I guess being arrogant to a certain degree and realizing that 21 years ago when I set up the company Manhattan Loft Corporation and I introduced the concept of loft living to the UK, which really took off amazingly well. And it was in 1997 when I saw an ad by Audi, the loft-type car. I knew that loft was really on the map. So I figured maybe we can actually change the attitude of high-rise living. And how do we create, out of high-rises, a community? And what this building is all about specifics. It's all about a particular kind of form of construction of what it is that we wanted. You know, one of the great things about developing something like St. Pancras, it's complicated, it's complex, but you also have a certain joy. So I practically live over there. And what I realized actually is that the lobby of St. Pancras is one that is incredibly buzzy. Everybody wants to come there. It's not just for those people that are staying in the hotel. It sort of becomes a center of a place. So one of the things that was very important for me is that we created a lobby that doesn't just act as a lobby for the residential, but also acts as a lobby for the hotel and as a lobby for the local community, because everybody from the East Village, or the Olympic Village, soon to be called East Village, going to Westfield and vice versa, they're going to be walking through that. And really what I want to do is...
1 minute.
1 minute, oh my God. All right, so how do we change development? So we're creating them. I decided to call it Manhattan Loft Gardens, not because I wanted the name, but basically Manhattan, aspirational. Loft, because what we're doing is we're actually creating double height. Gardens, because what we actually did is we created these cantilevered, these gardens, in sky gardens, which are relatively unique, bloody expensive to be built, but once they're going to be there, they're going to be very, very exciting. And what it offers, I want to create a sense of a community. What inspired me is very much the garden squares in London and the rest of the UK, which is quite unique to the UK. You don't have them everywhere else. And what do? Not only do they offer you a fantastic view, because you look over the gardens, but it also offers you a key to interact with your neighbors. So you got a key, the people living 4 doors down have a key, and etc. And it becomes sort of a catalyst for interaction. I myself find that very often, indeed, I'm guilty of the same. I don't really interact with my neighbor. And the question is, why not? If you aspire to something like that, and why not? And this is the second garden. This is another garden. So every garden has its unique presence and its desirability. And really, as a result, what I believe is, yes, it is Stratford. And yes, agent asked me, why are you doing in Stratford? It's far too expensive. And I simply say, Stratford has an infrastructure that is second to none. Stratford is where you got Westfield. Stratford is where things are going to happen. And Stratford is where things are affordable. I think it's really important to develop expensive building. And this building, by the way, I think is going to be the most expensive tower built in the UK, certainly. And that's simply because of the cost, because of my architect's complex design, which makes it incredibly expensive, but something that I totally endorse and I'm totally delighted with. And I think it's really important. I think to me, things don't happen because a neighbor has done it before. Things happen because you guide, you set the tone, you try to make it happen. And by doing so, I think you create a new lifestyle.
Let's leave it there. Thank you very much. Right, John.
Okay. Just to remind everybody in the room, I do have a wife and mortgage to support. So when we vote at the end, the answer to Angela's question, do we need lifts, is yes. Okay? Everybody just please remember that.
I put that one in especially for you.
Thank you, ma'am. So I'm very proud to be part of this industry. I've been doing it about 40 years, and I think most of the time I thought we did a good job and we were perhaps heroes. But as I've been getting older and crabbier, I think we have to also examine the possibility that maybe we're not always heroes. Maybe we're also slightly the villains of the piece. Well, let's stay upbeat for the moment. Why are we heroes? Well, I think that's pretty clear at the basic level. We're heroes because without us, all this rural England would be covered up in low-rise commercial and residential buildings. We make high-rise possible, and we all feel good and we come to work thinking that that's great. But naturally, there's kind of another side of this, because it's not always buildings like this extraordinary one Harry's just made in Stratford that have elevators in them. And we must be aware that over the last 30 years, we've participated in a lot of high-rises where social problems, crime have been the norm. And it's not necessarily just in poor areas. There are also many high-rises around the world which are gilded cages for the not-so-poor. As an example, I can think of a job in a city, almost 80 stories. It has 4 elevators. Now, I wouldn't put more in either because it takes away from the living space. But the fact of the matter is that the way we control elevators, some of those people are going to wait, if they're unlucky, 15, 20 minutes. It's nothing to do with this elevator, it's just pure capacity. And they then become prisoners of their own luxury. They can't get out very easily. And frankly, in our industry, our reaction to that, watch the face, has been to just close our eyes, to use the vernacular of the city I grew up in. Not my problem, mate, nothing to do with me. You know, I just sold you the lift, get on with it. And frankly, we can't go on taking that position. The reality is that we really need to be a little chastened and think, what can we do about this? It's not someone else's problem. We're a major contributor to the way these buildings are structured. What's our job? At Schindler, we published in conjunction with ETH, which is kind of the MIT of Switzerland, a study last year. We very fortunately won the Golden Lion at the Venezia Biennale. And it was a study based on a building called Torre David. It's in Caracas. This building was abandoned as a hollow shell in 1992. And something amazing happened about 10 years ago to this building. All the people who were living in shanty towns around it, people with literally nothing, they started to occupy this building. And they got up to about the 35th floor because, again, chastening for us, there are no lifts in this building. And they self-organised it. And they have cafes and shops and everything they need to create the village spaces they need to enable life to go on. And this is perhaps one of the more inspiring human stories you could ever imagine. These are people with nothing who realised the immense security provided by verticality that they don't have living in shanty towns on the hills of the city. And they took possession of this, they organised themselves, and I tell you, it's one of the most inspiring stories that I've ever come across. And really it brings into focus the things we've got to do. We have imposed central core designs. You know, you want a set of elevators, you all come into one place because that's the way it's going to work. Therefore, architecture for 100 years is basically built about the notion of everyone comes, one central core, that's it. Does that work always? No, it doesn't. We don't encourage the village principle. We typically have, as I say, these driven central cores which encourage isolation. We don't really take advantage of the safety opportunities. Verticality is safe. We've shown that in Caracas. People want it. But the reality is that unless you build that into the elevator controls, it's not going to happen. Because sometimes we have these small number of elevators in a residential building, we make leaving home very difficult. We have to rethink that completely. And the overwhelming conclusion then is that you end up with really an isolated lifestyle. And as I say, we've been sort of, yeah, that happens, here's the lifts, goodbye. And we have to change that. And we have to change it with what we call transit management. And what that means is we don't just turn around and say, okay, here are the lifts, here's the configuration, take it or leave it. We must be much more open to work with the architectural community to find out all the things that they're trying to achieve in their buildings and provide elevators to suit them, not ask them to produce buildings to suit us. That must change completely. We believe that mobility and safety are a human right. People shouldn't be locked up in their towers, whether they're rich or poor people. It just doesn't work. And finally, you know, we have to look at mobility in a goal-oriented way. I shouldn't be going to push a button and not knowing whether I'm at the ground floor in 15 minutes or not. I should be able to tell the system, maybe even the night before, I'd like to be at the airport at this particular time. And that system can calculate back for me, understanding the traffic conditions, when I need to be in the lobby. It can make a plan. It can tell me when I'm going to get my exclusive express line down to the lobby. And if I can work like that, I really can make these buildings work. But I guess, as I say, just to recap one thing, my overall message is, this is a little bit of a renaissance in our industry, because we finally understood that it's not the job of architects to make buildings to suit elevators. It's the job of elevator companies to make buildings to suit architects. And that was really my point. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, John. I think you've given us plenty of food for thought in our chat a little bit later as well. Yeah. Paul.
Thanks very much, Angela. Our practice is interested in generating, and what I want to talk about today is the narrative for tall buildings. I'm interested in talking about the creation of character in tall buildings. I want to talk about the design, or how design can give it personality. And really, what are the elements that make it tied to its particular location, rather than a sort of bland international style that we've seen quite occasionally occupy a lot of world towers. By way of example, I'm just going to use a few of examples of our own work, some of them unbuilt and some built. This is Croydon. This is the first project I'm going to show you, which is in the south of London. Croydon sort of stands as a testament to a vision of modernism, and particularly post-war Britain. It embraces modernism in all its traditional ways, where form, function, and structure are optimized. Fortunately, we have planners and we have clients, that's Stanhope and Places for People, who really want to embrace the optimism of this modernism, while still recognising its shortfalls. It's a mixed tenure tower with intermediate, so slightly social, half buying, plus private tenures. The flat sizes are to the London Housing Design Guide standards. There's a lot of generous amenities, external space, so there's generous balconies, a communal space at the ground floor, and we have a sort of roof terrace which has allotments and play space for again, that's communal. The design concentrates on proportion, detail, in particular the depth and layering of the facade. I suppose this layering consists of a brick grid set against black reconstituted stone panels, which are switched to articulate base, middle, and then top. Real contrast now. I'm going to go to Ghana and Accra. I know that's not particularly very European, but this is a project called Villaggio. It's our first project in Africa. It's finished. First phase was finished last year. I'm using this as an example of a building in a country where the architectural vernacular of tall buildings is really still at its formative stages. Accra mostly had, when we started, buildings that were maybe 6 stories high at the very most. It's actually one of the tallest buildings in the country. And here, the challenge was to create a tower which had predominantly blank facades, because we don't actually want windows very much, because it's too hot, the sunlight's too harsh, so we need deep recesses or very small windows. For the blank facades, we're inspired by the traditional Kente rug, which is on the left there, which is really a real integral part of the country's identity, whilst the Ghanaian flag on the right gave us the colour palette for the 3 towers, which will eventually be completed next year. Here's phase 1 in all its glory. The presidential palace is on the right. Incidentally, we got planning permission for this. We did a feasibility study, and the client rang up after Christmas and said it's got planning. Slightly different in London, but there we go. This is phase 1 completed, and commercially it's the most successful project in Ghana at the moment. It provides really generous private housing. It's got huge recessed balconies, you can see in the white bit there. And in some cases, these are over 200 square feet, so they're big balconies. You can see how we've appropriated the Kente rugs on the side. The other tower will be yellow, the other one, and the final one will be green. And you can hardly see the windows within those side facades. And there you can hopefully also see that the rendered facade, with its very deep recesses, provides a useful contrast. These are early sketches of a tower we're doing near Harry's one, only at the wrong part of Stratford, the wrong part of the railway lines, which is in East London, as probably many of you know. And this is a tower for student living. It's a very complex site in the centre of town, and it's joined on to a shopping centre that's sort of a slightly fading shopping centre, just to make it even more difficult. The repetitive nature of student living, there's 800 rooms in this building and it's 33 stories high, gave us very little to play with elevationally. So our tactic here was to treat the tower more sculpturally, and by using a series of sliding planes, inspired really by the parlour game Jenga. And here you can see the building, you can see the bus station at Stratford Station, you can see what's the fish shoals, that are a new piece of public sculpture, the yellow and green elements in our tower in the distance with its rippling facades. And effectively what we found interesting about this project was the concept, the tactical concept of the Jenga distorts the slab-like nature of this composition and alters its proportions. This is the BBC Television Centre, where we're creating a whole new mixed-use quarter of London for our clients, Stanhope, the BBC, Mitsui and Aimco. It'll eventually consist of 1,000 flats and about 1 million square feet of commercial space. It's a key part of the master plan is to create a new tower on the junction of Wood Lane. This is the site in 1904. It's the Indian Palace from the Franco-British exhibition, and this is how the area got its name, White City. Taking lead from this is the new scheme now. Perhaps obviously that we took the historical precedent and we decided to make the new building out of white faience. The proportion of this, the grids of this building became all important, but it also had the added benefit of creating quite a homogeneous composition, even though the flat types and balcony locations change as you go up the building. This is the television factory, the building itself, and the master plan respects this existing building, where the buildings around the site are arranged around a series of concentric rings around the central drum, which until last month was the heart of Television Centre. Our tower, the curved nature of our tower, allows us to dress the main road, the new public piazza, and respects this new composition. Finally, I'm going to go up to my hometown or city of Liverpool. And about 8 years ago, we finished this project, Unity, working with Lang O'Rourke, the contractors. The Twin Towers form a key backdrop to Liverpool's historic waterfront, which is actually a World Heritage Centre. The shorter tower is an office building, and the taller tower, pictured here, was at the time the tallest building in Liverpool at 27 stories. There's a number of secret messages in the building. Here are the two receptions, which are decorated with a series of abstract patterns. These patterns are actually taken from World War I battleships. These battleships were painted by artists, and vorticists became known as dazzle ships. The patterns confused the periscopes of U-boats, and torpedoes didn't know where the front or the back of the ship was. Through our research, we discovered that most of these were painted in Liverpool docks, and so in a way we were just reflecting on its history. And then ready to finish off, I mentioned that there were two towers, and this is one of our initial sketches. At first, we hoped that this sort of asymmetrical composition could be a bit like the elegance of Fred and Ginger. However, when we sort of looked at this in more detail, we realised that one was tall and skinny and the other was short and fat. And in the end, we realised that unfortunately it was more like this pair. So this final slide really just shows these twin towers within, you can see the Liver building on the right, one of the first buildings with elevators in Britain and one of the tallest buildings in Europe when it was built in 1908. But there is one final secret message in this building. Down the front, the black front of the tall building is a staircase which has a series of square and slit windows. And these windows spell out the name of my mother, Jan, in Morse code. Thank you very much.
Very nice you were able to do that at the very end.
It's good to bang a rope to do.
Yeah. I think we should ask some questions straight from the floor, because you've heard from a client, from a supplier of lifts and escalators, and from an architect who designs tall buildings. Just to have a kind of a feel of the audience, how many architects are in the audience? Put up your hand if you're an architect. And if you're a client, and if you're a developer or builder, and other. What are your others, just to get an idea?
General
Journalist?
I'm a social anthropologist and design strategist.
Excellent.
A consulting engineer.
I should have said engineers. How did I leave out our engineers? And the others, okay. You're all very welcome. Now what we want to have a lively debate and ask those questions you've always wanted to ask. And I want you to think of the first one for Harry.
I'm Alan Davidson from Hayes Davidson. Harry, you're good at spotting trends. You talked about spotting the loft trend. What trends are you spotting now that will emerge in 20 years' time?
In terms of development.
Yeah, residential development, sorry.
I mean, for me, it is. I mean, it's no longer a trend. I mean, what we're trying to do with Manhattan of Gardens is, I think people are moving, or people are accepting to live in high rises, and I think that is. I don't think it's a trend. I mean, it is happening. It's happening more and more and more for various reasons: economic reason, logical reason, etc. But what I think it's a trend that needs to be addressed, because it just becomes too homogeneous. You know, I mean, I think when you look at cities, you know, the problem is when you build something that is 3, 4, 5, 6 stories high, it doesn't really affect the cityscape. It might affect it if you're standing directly in front of the building. You know, I was speaking to a friend of mine who happens to live in Pimlico, and he was really complaining. I live in a lovely part of London, but I'm looking at a less lovely part of London. So I see it very much as a trend, and you know, and I think it's a healthy trend, but I think it's a trend that should be far more considered than what is going on at the moment.
Anybody else from the panel?
Yeah,
Paul.
I think there are some trends. I think Harry's project shows it, and Harry's firm has always been ahead of those things, but I think other people have been influenced by it. We're involved with a big project with Ballymore in Embassy Gardens, which is 9 Elms, is being transformed by the American Embassy. And what you're seeing there is almost which I think Harry's entrance image there that felt like a luxury hotel. You're seeing that sort of either copied or whatever's happened elsewhere, that the idea of you only get one chance of making a first impression, so that entrance hall being very grand, and then the bolting on of other amenities, like in Embassy Gardens there's a swimming pool, there's spa, there's a reading room, there's a TV room, there's a work room, an internet room. So actually those are starting to make, in the right sort of areas, the right values, a massive difference to people, to the marketplace, I think.
John, do you want to add anything to that on trends?
No, I think I'm trendless on that.
Well, I mean, would you like to see a trend where, I mean, what I thought your slides and your conversation was really interesting, because you're asking us to actually redefine the core of tall buildings, and right. I don't think that's something we've really addressed as architects or as developers.
Well, I guess what I'd like to see, and again, I mentioned that it may not be obvious from my accent, although I was brought up in this city, I spent most of my adult life in the United States and now Switzerland, so I don't really know very much about local trends. But what we'd like to see globally, which seems to me would apply very well to London, is a situation where a lot of buildings that are currently singly functional become multifunctional. And you know, to give you one perhaps quite simple example, you often see an office building and perhaps a proposal will come up where we'll put some apartments on top. Might make a lot of sense for a lot of reasons. To do that, most of the time, people need to have separate elevator service. And believe me, when we see some of these large multifunctional buildings from the east, they look like Swiss cheeses with all the different hoistways laid out in them for different elevators, different functions. And then it doesn't work because you take so much floor space away that nothing can actually get done. Imagine instead, however, that you have an office building with normal elevators in it, but that you configure those elevators so that if I drive into my underground parking lot for my residence, one of the elevators says, there's one of my private apartment owners. I will clear my calls. I will be down ready to meet that person as they get out of the cabin, out of their car. That person gets an express ride up to their apartments. As soon as we start from the garage, that elevator is effectively back in the office group because it can be assigned calls again because the system knows it's going to be available at the top. So as a resident, I had a beautiful express luxury ride up to my apartment. As an office worker, I felt no impact because losing one elevator from the group for 30, 40 seconds is no impact. And now I've got a building that's sustainable as both an office and a residence without actually using any more floor space. And it's that type of thing from our perspective we'd love to see.
Well, the example that I showed from Denmark, from Bjarke Ingels, from big architecture, I thought it was a very clever design because it meant that you could actually take your bicycle or your pram or your shopping, whatever it is, up an inclined ramp. You couldn't actually do that ramp in this country because our regulations are slightly different. They also have a continuous, I don't know if you can go back to those slides at the very beginning, it was about number 3 or 4, but it was just that you passed everybody's hall door and there was kind of a neighbourhoodness about it, which I really liked. And you could interact with people. People had a small little front garden where they could barbecue in the evening. And then you could actually look into these huge, big, in the middle of the figure of 8, you could look down into these wonderful gardens that were for the whole group. There was a cafe and restaurant on the ground floor, and there were lots of community spaces. So that was like just a very long, continuous road that was very sociable. That was a beautiful building that just encouraged good social cohesion, I guess. So it also had a few of the vertical lifts for when you needed them, or if it was a rainy day or whatever it might be. But I don't see that here just yet, but I would like to see that kind of thing comes in. I think another trend, so to speak, if we're talking about trends, is the rooftop living and accessibility that way, so that if all of your building isn't a continuous vertical rise, that a bit like the High Line in New York, where you can actually have a peaceful space on the 4th or 5th or 6th story, and you can actually use that as usable, green, sustainable, ecologically friendly space. And I wanted to ask you, Harry, actually, is this something that using rooftops open to public, or even getting the public in and over your buildings, is that something that you would encourage or discourage?
I mean, it's an interesting thing, is because, I mean, part of the reason, you know, besides trying to create a space where people can interact, i.e. the gardens, one of the issues that I personally have, and you know, as a developer, I say I'm guilty. I often find that everybody's interested in balconies because it sort of adds value. However, in London, it's not really that suitable to balcony. And when you look around, rarely do you see people sitting out there and really spending time. It's often used as storage, bicycle, or whatever it is. So what happened is in Manhattan of Gardens, we decided we're going to very deliberately get rid of the balconies. But what is important, Newham wants outdoor spaces. And it's very important that part of the planning that you provide outdoor spaces. So albeit I was delighted to do so, they felt that the gardens that I create have to be for the residents. Because if you offer to other people, like to the public, they felt I wouldn't be offering sufficient amenities. So unless that sort of changes, but I certainly do agree. I think there is, and you know, and it's something that people have realized in New York, all over the place. I think roofs are the best opportunity for everything. I mean, it's visible, it can be protected, it could be very elegant. It could be intimate, it could be less intimate. So I think to me, certainly roof is something that needs to be addressed. The problem is, with all those lifts that you put up there, you're going to have to come up with a different system where we don't have to have a lifting on the top, maybe we can do it on the ground and still get the speed.
Yeah.
Hello, Anthony Wood at the Council on Tall Buildings and Urban Habitat. I think it'd be useful to just bring in a couple of points that were made in previous sessions. This morning, Peter Rees was asked, why no high-rise in the City of London? And I think he answered it very well. In the interest of time, one thing he didn't say, which I've heard him say many times before, is that basically the iconic high-rise building, especially at the iconic end, is often just a safety cash deposit box for people who predominantly will not live in the building. You know, people outside the country, perhaps in less stable economic environments, who can afford to and buy these apartments and never intend to live there. And that's one of the reasons why he didn't want them in the city, because that would kill the city. The second thing is from the panel discussion before, which was about families in high-rise buildings, and specifically linking that to Asia, where, you know, if you take a city like Singapore, 80% of people live in government-built high-rise housing. You know, you just put those words together in the West, government-built high-rise housing, and it spells disaster. And by the way, most of the 20% other percent in Singapore live in private-built high-rise housing. So how come in Asia, in places like Korea and Hong Kong and China and other places that only embraced the tall building perhaps 40 years ago, they've made this transition to living with families in high-rise buildings, and yet in the West we have at best a deep-seated concern for it and a preference for living still in the suburban model.
Paul, would you answer that one?
Yeah, quite a few things there, Anthony. But I went to Tokyo about a month ago to have a look at housing projects there with Mitsui and Stanhope. And it was really interesting seeing where tall apartments in tall buildings is embraced and has been for quite a long time. I think the big thing that I realised over there, the difference, was that the sizes were quite a lot bigger. That storage was embraced, so that, and I'm talking about a lot of storage, so, you know, maybe the size of a small bedroom additional to the normal flat was given out. Things like balcony sizes were very, very large. And this entrance sequence that I mentioned before, feeling like you've arrived at a luxury hotel, was in all of them. And so I suppose in that sense, for a long time we built apartments that were too tight, too small, without storage, without these generous feelings at the ground floor, without other amenity space. I think the one thing that's happened that's been great in London since the recession has been that we're now, because weirdly we used to build affordable housing much bigger than private housing. So if you're building an affordable housing block of flats, it would always be about a third bigger with certain developers. So now we're building to these minimum London housing design guides, which are a reasonable size and do start to allow for things. So I think in a way and of course what building small sort of cardboard box flats didn't allow was families really to live in there. It was couples or rented apartments. So I think in some ways I can see a resurgence in that. And obviously the sort of quality projects that we're starting to see now is going to make a difference. I think the second point about the sort of super rich that are buying apartments and the whole issue with, you know, doing 3 weekends in Kuala Lumpur, Shanghai and Hong Kong to sell apartments, and then people buying apartments that they never live in, is a relatively new phenomenon in London. I think there was a statistic at the weekend, I think, that said that 75% of, I think it's about 6,000 apartments sold in London last year. 75% were bought by people from overseas. I think there's a little bit of panic about this. I mean, I don't know what Peter Rees is talking about. I mean, if he's ever been to the city in the evening, it is dead. So I don't know how having apartments that aren't fully occupied is going to make a big difference. But you know, I feel in a way what's happening at the moment in London is these foreign sales are starting to certainly really regenerate parts of London. And if you look at the other cycles in Britain, maybe 12 years ago, 10 years ago, when we had the boom all over the country, all of that was fueled by buying to rent. Anyone who says something otherwise, particularly in the northern towns like Liverpool, and mixed with cheap money. And I think what we've got now is we haven't got the cheap money, so not everyone can get involved, but still it's fueling regeneration that would not have happened otherwise. And what I think you find in Britain is after that has embedded itself, you're not building a building for 3 years, you're building a building for 50 years, and eventually those places are going to become regenerated.
But I think also a lot has got to do with, if you're talking about China or Vietnam, it's to do with the availability of land and the cost of land. But you're talking about, when you say the sizes in London in the tall and high-rise buildings now are very large, that's because they're private. What about the social housing sector? Or for the rental market?
No, I was saying that nowadays that all developers build to the London Housing Design Guide at a minimum. As you get to the higher end of the market, people go bigger. So I think the minimum is much better than it used to be. I think affordable is still has a reasonable size due to the Housing Design Guide. Still never deals with families and with high rise, and that's the bigger issue, I think.
I think one of the biggest issues actually with high-rise and families where you've got small kids, say two parents and two kids, it's where is this play space? And when we had research done before on this, it was, you have to have the eye contact to the playground or the space outside for the safety or so that you know where your kids are and all of that. But in North Europe, they seem to manage this and do it very well. Certainly in Denmark and in Holland, they've got very good housing. It's not too high, it's maybe 10 stories, but they can manage to have families and to work out that whole section very well. Can I have a question here from the lady here?
Yeah. My name's Jonas Strollitz. I've always been an advocate of shared facilities in buildings, and so I kind of intuitively like what Harry's talking about. But if one looks at the workplace typology, the kinds of office buildings that gave you all singing, all dancing, internalized amenities, we discover from user research that people actually don't particularly want to use those. Those are part of the supply chain offer, but in terms of the user experience, people prefer to use the facility in the location of choice with the company of their choice. And I think that if one extrapolates from that to housing, you have to question the enduring relevance of having a lot of internalized facilities higher up the building instead of on the ground plane where the users can have more choice and where the ability to use the facilities could also be taken up by people who are living in other buildings.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Harry, do you want to expand on that?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think part of using a facility, I mean, I do agree with you. I think as a developer, in the past, you introduce elements that sort of add a sort of sex appeal to the building. Is it a gym? Is it a cinema? Is it this and everything else? I mean, where I disagree with you, I think outdoor spaces that are used, all you have to do is go to the parks, a decent day, they're always full. The squares are full, the things. So I don't think it's the level that really makes a difference. I mean, if it's on the ground floor, if it's on the top floor, I think people will use it provided it's easily accessible. So I'm not convinced that bringing everything just to the ground floor level and making it available to the neighborhood is the solution. I think really, what are we trying to do with a high rise? I mean, I think that the essence of high rise at the beginning, in my view, is, especially if it's residential, is I have to provide you with an apartment that in as much as possible meets your aspiration and satisfies your needs. And be it a great entrance hall, be it gardens, be it all sorts of amenities, I think to me, that is absolutely key. I mean, what we are certainly trying to do at the Manhattan Loft Gardens is we are very much trying to speak with HS1 because where we are, the position of it is actually the walkway between International and Westfield. And what we really want to do is we want to see how can we animate that element of the forecourt to make it more interesting. And there the choice is almost endless. Do you work with the local communities? Is it art? Is it local art? Is it international art? Is it whatever? And I think those are the sort of things that should be explored. I mean, if I have a criticism of London developers, I think it is very rare. I mean, besides Canary Wharf, all those years ago when the Rahman first built it, they actually built a space where the exterior space was as important as the building because their vision was how do people react within the environment and what can they do? Too often do you find high rises where it's all about the pound per square foot that you get for your space and what can I get from my outside space. So I think that sort of rationale should become more and more relevant. I mean, you made a reference, for example, what you're doing in Croydon, that you have outside spaces. I think it's becoming a factor, but in my opinion, it's still very much of a limiting factor because what am I giving away? How many square feet am I giving away from potential income? And I really think that sort of trend needs to be changed because I believe certainly is, and and it's not only in development, it's in everything, be it from food to clothes, everything else. It's all about value, it's all about what you offer. And I think the more amenities, so I'm totally encouraging that you do offer, but that they have a sense of purpose as opposed to sort of there for the moment, I think is really valid.
I wanted to ask John about this because the tall building that you showed us without lifts in Caracas, where it is a vertical village, some of those stories, I mean, that must be 20 stories high. People don't go up and down every day. They must be almost trapped up there or enjoy village vertically. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, I think it is a question of the people's attitude. First of all, everyone is thrilled. There's no issue of, this is inconvenient. It's very inconvenient getting killed if you're living in a shanty town. That's inconvenient. This is wonderful because it's safe and nice. This is something they own together. They feel this sense of ownership. And they are just all outdoors and not closed. They're talking to each other. If there's a spare area, someone will set up a store or they set up a cafe. There's a great sense of community. And as I say, these are the poorest people in the world, and we could learn a lot from them. You talk about shared services. I obviously represent a service that everyone has to share because they don't have a choice. But even then, sometimes they would rather be apart. And to be very open about it, where I live in Switzerland, we don't have high-rise residences, but almost everybody lives in an apartment, and everybody does share the services. And it's a sort of chicken and egg. Why is it? Is it you get the sense of community and then people share the services, or they share the service and therefore build the sense of community? I don't know, but I know that the services get shared and there is a wonderful sense of community when you meet people in it. Maybe one small trick is when you move into any apartment block in Switzerland, you're given 3 months to get your house in good shape, and then you have a party and you must invite everybody and introduce yourself properly and become part of that building. So, I don't know which way drives it, but I do know when community is there, the services will be used.
I like the sound of that. Paul, do you think that happens in your buildings?
It depends which clients. I mean, we do lots of work with different sorts of people, from the Red Rose, who are the more volume house builders who put a lot of work into that, to Urban Splash, who specialise in sort of trying to build a community. The one in Croydon is for People for Places, who very much are involved with that. And I think whether or not they have a party every week, they certainly have a communal space that is used for kids' parties, used for other people's parties. And I think increasingly that's going to be a key part of it. So, but I always thought in Switzerland, the problem, whenever I've been there, the thing is that the apartments are so much bigger than ours. I mean, they really are. We're talking about 1.5 to two times, and that just takes all the pressure off things, I think, and that's the big difference.
Well, I mean, for example, the size of apartments, it's out for consultation now by the government. Anyone who wants to actually make any comments, you can find it on the RIBA website. But
the trouble is, Angela, if we make it statutory to make them any bigger, then at a one-bedroom flat, in some areas being £500,000, where we really are going to have London where everyone in Zone 3 is rich and everyone outside Zone 3 is not. Yeah. And so it's a double-edged sword, and that's why, of course, a lot of developers like Ballymore do studio flats, so they are affordable, and there is a slight mix of tenure. I have to say, when I was young, there weren't these nice studio flats that you could buy for sort of not obviously vaguely affordable. There were just crummy converted bedsits everywhere in London. I mean, if you think what's happened in the last 20 years, it's a revolution, really.
Mm. Okay, let's get another couple of questions from the floor. This person here.
Vineet Khanna, architect from Delhi. My question is actually for the panel and maybe John to figure it out. Harry talked of beautiful terraces, but let's say if you have 2-3 buildings with beautiful terraces and I want to hop on to the other one, how does it work? Because it has a lot of municipal constraints to make either a skywalk or a horizontal lift or a ropeway going through. I mean, we'll have fun at the high level, as the lady said. Why everything should come on the ground? I sincerely feel that we should have fun at the high level. And technology, as you said, we do whatever architects want. I mean, why is it that those possibilities are not explored? Is it because of the ownership constraint that each building happens vertically and that's it? You can't connect one terrace of the building to the other, there is competition or there is... And the other question to it is, can we have common service cores to feed 5 buildings or 6 buildings? I mean, the first one is, of course, connecting the terraces.
Yes, certainly. Obviously, if you have a building and it's sort of, you know, one can think of all sorts of structures like that, where you might just have a service core and then feeding out to different buildings. There's a building, I wish I could think of the name, in Singapore, where they have actually connected several towers with a walkway. Maybe you can think of the name of it. But extremely successful, and exactly for that reason, because of the social cohesion, because I now walk past my neighbours' buildings. So no, I think this is absolutely on topic, and that's something we should be doing. And from our point of view, for sure, we love to see ideas like that, and something we very much would support with product.
Yeah, we make provision for helipad. We can make provision for horizontal connectivity to terraces.
Right.
Won't be too expensive.
Right.
I recently saw a helipad design in Ho Chi Minh City, and they had a 35-story high tower, and about 6 stories from the top, they had this helipad sticking out from the side. Not only did it not work because you couldn't land a helicopter with the wind, the updraft, but it only kind of served as a brise soleil for a few, accidentally you could say, and that the wrong type of glass was used in this building, so it actually absorbed more heat into the building, and there was practically a swimming pool's worth of water from the air conditioning plant. So very often, buildings are copied in certain cities without the knowledge and experience, and I think that it's so important to get it all right. Because when we have in the BRIC countries such vast expanding cities that seem to pop up overnight, I think it's very important that we share knowledge. And you mentioned the integrated design, an integrated design strategy and the right infrastructure so that we can actually help make cities of the future work. But one thing I think that we haven't really touched on yet is how can we make the success of buildings socially so that we have a diverse mix or a mixed tenure within the same building? I don't know, Harry, if you've actually done any of these yourself yet, or what's your approach to having diversity of people within your buildings?
I mean, if I go back to my first development in Manhattan Loft Corporation, which was in 1992 in Summer Street, where I introduced the concept of loft living. Now, you know, when you introduce it, you know, it's a new idea, etc. And I figured, okay, 24 flats in London, you should find buyers. And that was really it, you know. Will I ever go beyond that? I doubted it, but 24 I would find. And what I did find was, in fact, it wasn't 24, it was more like 20 because a number of people bought more than one flat. But what I thought was really the most, to me, was a revelation was, because obviously we created the shell. And the inside, people did on their own. So you almost had like a country home in some people. You had a director from KPMG buying there. You know, the fact that you had the people from, you know, the photographers, the film business, etc. But I really believe at the end of the day, as a developer, you'd be surprised. People want to be excited by something that is novel. People want to experience certain things. And I think if you offer the opportunity, you'd be surprised how diverse a community can be. So I don't think buildings have to be homogeneous in any shape or form whatsoever. I think create something exciting, and I think the public out there that you couldn't even imagine, I think would be drawn to it. Mm.
What about, Paul, what about in London? Do you think that with so many of our buildings that we have in the last 20 years, do you think that there's enough diversity of our building types?
Well, I think getting back to the working on different levels, I do think London is, because of the nature of freehold, it struggles to have anything other than, in terms of mixed use, it struggles to do anything other than have things at the ground floor, and that's it. And I've often thought, say, it must be, it'd be highly appropriate in a tower that was designed for families or bigger units to have a crash or something halfway through that could link onto outdoor space. Very difficult to start to imagine anyone wanting to do those things, but it would make you then attach a cafe to it, etc. The idea of city sandwiches, so buildings that change as you go up. The idea of having 5 floors of office below. I mean, the Shard does it. There's not many other buildings that do it. In Tokyo, everything does it. So I think there's that idea of mixed use. In terms of mixed tenure, I mean, obviously over here we have private housing for sale. We then have that mixed version, intermediate, where you're half buying, half selling. And those two types of tenures can sit quite happily together. The pure affordable never can, because of the cost of the service charge, plus normally the residential social landlord prefers to have their own separate core. They can be next to each other, so they can be cheek and jowl. But I think getting it to mix up within a tower would not be possible, I don't think, in this country. In Denmark,
we have done one for Ballymore, same client as you.
Yeah, well...
Yeah, 200 homes in the Isle of Dogs, 25% private, mainly at the top, with a separate core. 25% large family on the ground floor with front gardens and mixed playing space. And then the middle 50%, it's the scheme I showed earlier on my slide.
Yeah.
And the 50% is key worker. Shared spaces, I think.
But it had a separate core. That's my
separate
point.
core. It was a separate core,
Yeah.
and that was to do with, as you say, it was the ownership and the management.
You can do
but
that.
within the same complex,
Yeah, good.
did have this mix,
Yeah.
and it's one of the few. It's actually one of the few in London that does that.
Yeah.
Yeah. But can I ask some more questions? Anything that people are really keen to ask our panel here?
Can I share?
Yes, and then we'll have you.
We've done a mixed-use development and mixed income, 1995. I'm Jun Palafox from Manila, together with SOM, where we had the first class, the business class, and the economy class in 5 towers. There's shared facilities for everybody. There's also a more exclusive club, but you have to pay more. And it's the highest value appreciating development there the past 15 years. And the taller towers, like the 46 stories, they have helipads because the fire engines can only serve up to the 10th floor. So we have that also. And interconnected, it's like a village within a city. But these are large-scale private developments. Another large-scale private development also in Makati, Philippines. They develop about 100 hectares. They can change the floor area ratio provided you pay a development charge, like an impact fee. But the value appreciation for every floor area ratio increase, it's about 5 to 20 times. And this variation charge or development charge, it's used to buy more facilities, like interconnected elevated walkways, private parks, and so on. But these are privately run developments and association of building owners. And you can also buy air rights. Let's say they relax the restrictions from FAR4 or plat ratio 4, you can go to 16. But anything beyond the FAR4, you pay a development charge. But the value appreciation is 5 to 10 times. So people are willing to pay that extra charge, some kind of an impact fee that goes to a private fund. And it seems to be very successful. And I think that's being done in other Southeast Asian countries.
Very interesting. There was another question just here. There you go on your left.
Hi, Richard Witt from Quadrangle Architects in Toronto. We do a lot of residential work, and Toronto, well, Canada, but Toronto specifically as the last outpost of economic prosperity in the Western world, has seen an enormous amount of residential building in the past 5 years. Last year, 25,000 units were sold. But there's a similar situation to the way that you've described it, that money kind of is pouring into Toronto, which is exceeding the demand, although there is an increasing demand. It's exceeded that, but it's picked up on the lack of purpose-built rental accommodation. And I'm wondering if in London there has been a lot of purpose-built rental accommodation being built, and if somehow the speculative residential construction and sales has affected that market.
That's a good question. Harry, would you be able to?
Yeah, I think what has happened is, traditionally it was house builders that developed residential developments. And those are the ones that did it, and people like myself, independent. I think what is happening is the opportunity, the financial opportunity from residential development has broadened quite dramatically. So what you do have at the moment is you have quite a few commercial developers who are quite interested. Part of it because it's slightly forced upon them because some of the planning issues is you have to do some residential, but they also really recognize it. And what is happening at the moment, a lot of insurance companies and everybody else really recognizes there is a lack of rental, and rental in London is really quite expensive. You know, it's not affordable per se, it's quite expensive. So it's starting to make commercial sense. And I think what is happening is there are quite a few private initiatives from the, especially from the insurance sectors, that is really focusing on that. For example, the former Athlete Village, which is being rebranded as East Village, which is Qatari and Delancey, it's all for rental. And the reason being is because they do realize that, you know, A, they were lucky to buy it at a reasonable price, and beyond that, they do recognize that the demand is there, and the value will increase over time, especially in location such as Stratford, which is just at the beginning of its region. I mean, a lot of it has happened, but there's still a long way to go. So now you definitely see a trend from only privately owned to people specifically. There's also a government initiative who recognizes that there's a lack of affordable rental, and they're putting, so, you know, so if you build within £400 or £500 a square foot, if that's your affordability, you can almost get government funding and subsidies to afford that in order for the sector to be, you know, for the private rental sector to be satisfied. So there's quite a few initiatives.
This is maybe since the recession happened, people have been talking about the private rental market, and it's amazing how, I mean, the Qatari DR one is one of the few big examples, isn't it, still, because the financial model of it is very different. I mean, most of the bigger house builders make their money by selling flats and then building the thing afterwards, and that's the traditional model. Or at the end, they sell it completely, so they have the money that way. So it doesn't quite fit into the same market. I think that's why it's having trouble to get going. But I think the idea that you know, the ones we've looked at, but still not quite got to the next level, highly serviced apartments, you know, where there's a laundrette, you put things out, you know, there's a lot of convenient other things, that social aspects of it are really important. I suppose like a sort of upmarket hall of residence in a way, but sort of only where the apartments are bigger, where that aspect for younger people, younger professionals, it could be, you know, I think there's a real opportunity in the marketplace, but it's amazing how few have happened so far.
I think it's quite interesting what you say about investment in Toronto. I used to work in Toronto for a year or so, and I think that you've still got a very strong Canadian dollar. It was well protected during the recession. So a lot of people actually invested in places like Toronto. And I think that, like London, we're in bubbles. And I think that where there's been a lot of foreign investment, certainly in London, you do have a lot of buildings that are standing sort of empty. A lot of the buildings that were started 2 or 3 years ago have stopped, and they're rethinking how, like the Helter Skelter. Are they going to continue with the original plan for one use, whether it be offices, or will they actually change that? So I think that with the great intentions of London suddenly having lots of towers, it is definitely a time to pause and to think how we are going to continue with some buildings and maybe change. So thank you for those comments. I wanted to ask the panel about our historic city, and at the moment there has been much talk from UNESCO about protecting World Heritage Sites. And one of them being the Houses of Parliament and Big Ben, protecting views. And if you know the cheese grater, for example, the cheese grater by Roger Stirk Harbour is particularly at an angle to protect that long view of St. Paul's, which is a protected view. I'm interested to hear from the panel first, and then from yourselves on the floor. Do you think that we should be having any protected views, heritage views, or do you think we should just let buildings go up anywhere? So Paul, starting with you.
Well, I was here at the last session with Stuart Lipton dismissing, it was generally agreed at the end that the views were all a waste of time, and Terry Farrell agreed with that, and Graham Stirk, who designed the cheese grater, I think probably agreed with that. It does seem very odd. It's funny, Alan's here at the front, and Alan does this fantastic talk about how these historical views are fixed moments in time, but actually they're not dynamic, and you read cities dynamically, so you don't actually stand in Primrose Hill and look at St Paul's for 2 hours. You actually are walking, you're moving, just like when you're going over the bridges. You see St Paul's Cathedral, but it's a dynamic position. So I think it's time we did start to think again about how we could create other ways of relating. It's weird. Our office, we just built another floor, and we're by the Barbican. So it's a view, there's not many tall buildings, and you look at the city and you just go, it's just a complete and utter mess, because there's no protected view where we are. We have a bit of St Paul's Cathedral. It's a mess, but it's an exciting mess. So part of me wonders in the city how possible it is to control anything, but it seems archaic now, and we need something more sophisticated.
John, do you think it's archaic?
Well, I think I agree with Paul that it has to be more sophisticated, but I certainly don't think, I think I'm old and sentimental enough to not want to give up all the wonderful views of London just yet. But I do take your point that at some point there's a certain constraint, but I think it's like everything else. It's a grey area. You must have some areas of London, I think, and all the major cities have this, where you can look at it, it's an iconic view, and even if it's 200 years old, you don't feel bad about it. But at the same time, London is not a Paris with an entirely separate business area. It is a thriving, growing city, and that has to be accommodated. And I think that, you know, with people like the folks in this room, I don't see why we can't do both.
Harry, does it prevent you from building what you want where you want?
I think it's a good idea to protect views. You know, I think, of course, it's a lot easier not to, because you can build anything you want, everything else. First of all, is, you know, as far as I'm concerned, I mean, St. Paul is quite an attractive building. It's hard for me to find one of the more contemporary buildings that is equally good. So as far as I'm concerned, especially if I'm in the views line, I'd rather look at that and look at something that is being built over the last 10 or 15 years. So I think, hey, give me a choice of looking at equally good buildings. I'm all for obliterating the view, because I'll be looking at something nicer. But you know what? Just because you want to build big and that offers you greater thing, let's be flexible. Let us live with rules. Let us try to create a great city. I mean, London isn't boring. I mean, we can do certain things. I feel incredibly privileged. My office is on the 5th floor, but slightly double heights, probably more of the 7th floor, and I can sort of look all over London. I can see the tall buildings in the background. Luckily, they're not so close, so I don't really see some of the things, maybe the faults in some of them. But no, kidding aside, I think, one just simply wants to, why? In order to make life easier? Is that really what we should be doing as developer? We should let's have an easy life. Let's build whatever we want. I mean, yeah, sure. They do it in Texas. Houston, you can build anything you want. You can have a house of 1 story, and you can have a tower of 100 stories, Maybe that's what we should do in London now. But I think what we should do is, we should certainly be sensitive to it. You mentioned Primrose Hill. I went to Primrose Hill. To be honest, I haven't been there probably ever. But I went there probably a month and a half ago together with my daughter, and I was delighted with the view.
You stand on the hill and you can see the view right
and I think it's great. So I think this sort of kind of thing is that, look, I think this is silly and that is silly, and let us try simply. We are in a business where we have to have a responsibility to what is happening to the city. It's not just to our pocketbook. And I think in order to do that, if we have certain restriction, let's live with the restriction. If those restrictions prevent us from doing developments, i.e. there's no alternative, by all means, let's reconsider everything. But as long as there are alternatives, I think we should go with living, despite Sir Stuart Lipton or other people at what they might be saying.
I'd be interested just to take a quick straw poll. Who would be, if you raise your hand, if you think that we should keep protected views? Okay, now raise your hand if you do not think we should keep protected views. Okay, that's very interesting. That's very interesting. For those of you that couldn't see, there were 3 hands up for not keeping protected views, and then there was about 65% of the rest that were in favour. So that's very interesting, taking a quick straw poll like that. I wanted to just ask a little bit about quality of life and tall buildings, because a lot of people say that, and in fact we touched on it earlier, that tall buildings and the quality of life, it can either be enhanced from the security point of view and can be quite suitable for elderly people if they're within a community. But what about the psychological effects of living in tall buildings? What about the social effects and the quality of life? So Paul, do you think that the quality of life in a tall building would be similar to a horizontal village?
I spent about 6 months living in the Trellick Tower, which is one of the tallest residential towers in London, in West London. I have to say, it wasn't the happiest time of my life. I was so hot, we were 27 floors up, and what you saw there was clouds and no views of London, because you just looked out and you didn't get any view. But I must confess, I really enjoyed my time there. It was when it was in a transitional phase from having very little security to then getting security. It was when I was a student. So it could be quite terrifying arriving in the building late at night and not quite knowing who's going to get in the lift with you and where they were going to go. But all of that has completely changed. I think there is something, it took me about 3 months to get used to actually, when I looked out the living room, I couldn't see anything and all I could just see was sky. That said, what that building didn't have is what, say, Harry's building would have, which is I pop up 2 floors and there's a fantastic garden to go and read a book. I pop down 3 and there's something else going on. I think those are the things that can really change things. If you look at like Unité, I know it's in the south of France, but by Corbusier, where you've got a middle zone where there's almost a mini shopping centre with cafes and bars, and then the top floor has a creche and a running track. And I don't know, I think we should just use every inch of these buildings as much as we can. I think that will be the way of making people less lonely within them. I think the other thing is, as you alluded to earlier, is the people who look after the building. It's their job not just to collect the rent or service charge, it's their job to actually look after people. And I think not enough emphasis on this in this country is put on the people who look after buildings. Often it's money for old rope and they don't have to do anything. I think they need to be less passive and try and create spaces and places that people want to live in.
Absolutely, absolutely. Or I'll move straight on to my last question for the panel, starting with you, Harry. Identity of buildings. Very often we talk about nicknames for buildings and the identity. And I think one of the most popular London buildings would be the Gherkin. So Foster's Gherkin has got its nickname. It's a popular building. It's got the cafe on the top floor that can be rented out. With identity, if there were 20 Gherkins, it wouldn't quite be the same. But because there's one of them and it's quite iconic and it's detailed beautifully, it's quite special. I know, Paul, that you also touched on it earlier when you were talking about the identity or the special character that buildings might have. So in summing up, tell me your thoughts on the identity for tall buildings. What do you think the identity should be? Should it be iconic as viewed from the outside? Should it be something that's socially interactive? Should it be? What are your thoughts?
I think tall buildings should be a sense of place. I think by virtue of the height, I think it has to have a presence, and I think if it achieves that, and I don't think you can look at it from the outside or the inside. I think it's being half dressed. I think it requires both from the inside and from the outside. In terms of giving it a name, why not? But I'm always bemused by those. But I really believe that an identity, as a developer, creating good buildings really makes you feel good. It's like an artist creating a red painting. And for us, it should be lasting for a long time. So I certainly believe in identity. I believe that buildings shouldn't be homogeneous. I think buildings should have a character. I think buildings should have a sense. And most important, buildings should have a purpose.
John?
No, I love the idea. Frankly, sitting on this panel today, seeing what's been done by my colleagues here, it really does leave you with an abiding sense of optimism. that buildings can really be made to be different and individual and reflect the needs of the people. What I would say is that, coming back to what I said at the very beginning, I'm trying to promote the idea that we've really removed one very significant constraint, because everything that's really built today has this notion of a big core in the middle full of elevators, and we're saying think outside that box now. Really imagine buildings with totally different configurations, which gives perhaps a lot more scope for designing things that can be individualised. Let us worry about the elevators, you worry about making great designs, and I believe we'll have even more individual great places for people to live.
That's great. So think outside the core.
Yeah, I think the buildings that become embedded just in terms of very strong images are things that have a great sense of ground, where the ground plane works very well. And I think, this morning I saw a presentation about the Leadenhall building where the whole ground is given away. I think the way big taller buildings hit the ground is we've gone through a lot of learning in that over the last 10 years. I think the only time we haven't really had a nickname, I'm not really that mad on that. I think those things grow, but our building in Liverpool, they used to say we'd is that the building with a porter cabin on top, which was not quite what our clients wanted to hear after spending a lot of money on stainless steel.
Thank you all very much, and I want you to put your hands together for our panel. Thank you. Thank you.